This week, we had an explosive hearing in front of the House Oversight Committee featuring 3 former government officials with allegations of the existence of non-human spacecraft. In a previous video, I covered the hearing, and in part 1 of this series, I lay the groundwork for what I believe is the answer to the question, why now, which is my theory of the case, an authentic, organic, constitutional struggle between the legislative branch and the executive branch over who has authority over UFO materials. In part 1, we covered the origin story of OSAP, the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Applications Program, a previously classified government UFO study program that was created by Harry Reid as a black budget program in 2008 that was shut down subsequently in 2012. OSAP then evolved into ATIP, the second UFO study program that has now become public by the government, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, and the existence of ATIP became public knowledge thanks to a December 2017 New York Times news article. In response to the New York Times article that came out in 2017 that went viral globally, we started to see actions being taken both within the executive branch and the legislative branch. Over the course of 3 years between 2017 and 2020, Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon, who I gave background on in my previous video, led the charge in briefing congressional representatives about the data that was uncovered in the ATIP program. The goal of ATIP was to gather and centralize all of the video and multispectral data as well as witness testimony from active duty military pilots and aviators. Elizondo and Mellon began bringing these Navy pilots to classified briefings within the Senate Intel Committee. So within the Congress, the legislative branch, they have 2 chambers, the House and the Senate. Each of those chambers has several committees and subcommittees that are focused on specific issues. The Senate Intelligence Committee has the oversight role over all intelligence programs within the executive branch of the government. Every year, one of the big responsibilities for the Senate Intel Committee is to propose legislation to be included in the Intelligence Authorization Act, the IAA. The IAA covers all of the mandates that Congress in the legislative branch dictates to the intelligence community in the executive branch for how they are supposed to operate. After receiving classified briefings from multiple pilots and aviators over the course of several years in the wake of the 2017 New York Times article, in June of 2020, the Senate Intel Committee took its first action in this constitutional struggle between the power over UFO materials between the legislative branch and the executive branch. As a part of the IAA for 2021, which is drafted and then signed into law in 2020, the Senate Intel Committee mandated that the Department of Defense, within the executive branch, create a new office, the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Task Force. The 2 primary goals for the UAP Task Force were, number 1, standardize the collection of UAP data across the military and the intelligence community, which are within the executive branch of the government, because at the time, there was no process or mechanism with which a pilot or an intelligence official who had a sighting could report it anywhere. The second goal was to create a report, both an unclassified and classified version, that would be required to be given to Congress with the findings and conclusions of the UAP task force as they gathered the data across the military and the intelligence community. The IAA was signed into law at the end of 2020, which meant that the executive branch was required to provide this report to Congress in the summer of 2021. And the mastermind behind this decision was former presidential candidate and Republican from Florida, Marco Rubio, who became the first person in Congress to make a public statement about the UAP topic related to his proposed legislation to create the UAP task force. And here's what he had to say.
We have things flying over our military bases and places where we're conducting military exercises, and we don't know what it is, and it isn't ours. So that's the legitimate question to ask. I would say that, frankly, that if it's something of outside this planet, that might actually be better than the fact that we've seen some technological leap on behalf of the Chinese or the Russians or some other adversary that allows them to conduct this sort of activity.
Almost exactly a year later, in June of 2021, the UAP task force would release their preliminary assessment on UAP. Side note, remember our buddy Jay Stratton from part 1? The senior naval intelligence guy who helped lead OSAP, the original UFO study program, and that personally recruited Lou Elizondo to be the director of ATIP, the predecessor to OSAP. He was the director of the UAP task force. The preliminary report is publicly available and online and had several conclusions, including the fact that there were not the proper reporting mechanisms currently in place for military or intelligence personnel to even report these issues. There is also not a centralized process in order to analyze what was actually happening with this data. But for the data that they were able to gather within the first 6 months of the existence of the task force, they categorized the sightings into a variety of different buckets: airborne clutter, foreign collections platforms, balloons, but there was a catch-all other bucket where they did state there are several instances where we are tracking what appear to be craft presenting capabilities that are outside any known platform that we are aware of at this time. Shortly after we found out that Marco Rubio, alongside Kirsten Gillibrand, were spearheading the creation of the UAP task force to report what the DoD actually knew and understood about the UFO issue to Congress and subsequently the American public, there was a snippet in this July New York Times article that references UFO crash retrievals for the first time in popular media. The article is titled "No Longer in Shadows, Pentagon's UFO Unit Will Make Some Findings Public." And in this article, towards the bottom, we're introduced for the first time to a gentleman named Eric Davis. Now, Eric Davis is a scientist who's been working throughout classified programs associated with the UFO issue for a number of decades. In this article, Davis stated that he was giving classified briefings of retrievals of unexplained objects to staff members of the Senate Armed Services Committee in 2019, as well as the Senate Intel Committee. These briefings by Davis, alongside the briefings from military pilots and aviators, are largely what drove Rubio and Gillibrand to push for the UAP task force to be created in the IAA for 2021. Going into 2022, the table was now set for the UFO issue to accelerate significantly. We have established who the players are in the executive branch that have been trying to get this information out to the public. We have now identified who on the legislative branch was a first mover in creating legislation that would grease the wheels to allow more of this information to come out. In 2022, a lot of this began to really ramp up. Now we can see the tension and conflict between the executive and legislative become clear, because at this point, the DoD, the Director of National Intelligence, and the UAP task force, which lived in the executive branch, were telling Congress, yeah, we're kind of seeing a couple things. Some of them are a little bit weird, but we need to study it more to figure it out. At the same time, you're having whistleblowers from within the DoD, from the executive branch, coming to Congress and saying, we have crash retrieval programs, we have multiple craft, and here are the details. So this led to the first hearing in the House Intel Committee in over 50 years on the subject of UFOs.
So you're not aware of anything in between Project Blue Book and ATIP?
I'm not aware of anything that's official that was done in between those two. Okay. Hasn't been brought to my attention.
So the DoD's official position is Project Blue Book in the 60s. The only other thing we did was ATIP. That's it.
And then finally, are you aware of a document that appeared around 2019, sometimes called the Admiral Wilson Memo or EW Notes Memo?
I am not.
You're not. I'm not personally aware of that.
EW Notes? What is that? Remember Eric Davis from the New York Times article, the one briefing the Armed Services Committee on crash retrievals and non-human spacecraft? The EW Notes stands for the Eric Wilson Notes, or notes taken by Eric Davis in a conversation he had with Admiral Thomas Wilson, who is the former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, executive branch, that they had in 2002 in a parking lot outside of EG&G, which is a government contractor. The notes became public because of a leak out of the estate of the late astronaut Edgar Mitchell. And in the conversation, Thomas Wilson, who was on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was allegedly not allowed to be read into a crash retrieval program that he had successfully located, and he was looking to talk to Eric Davis to figure out if he had any other information. This is the first time that crash retrievals were put into the congressional record. We have since gotten new legislation for whistleblower protections, more follow-on hearings, and this is how we've gotten to the place we are today.